Welcome to Godless and Grounded. There is a reason every religion that thrives on obedience needs a hell. Fear is the oldest and most effective form of control. You can argue with a person, you can resist a law, but how do you argue with eternal fire? The idea of endless punishment is not about justice, it is about power. The church sold hell not as a belief, but as a tool, a psychological weapon designed to make people obey. When you think about it, no concept in religious history has done more to silence doubt, control behavior, and protect authority than the idea of hell. But here is what most people do not realize. The idea of hell as a fiery, eternal torture chamber does not come from Jesus. It does not come from the Hebrew Bible. It comes from centuries of church invention, fear-mongering, and interpretation, a slow evolution of myth, politics, and manipulation. Let's start from the beginning. In the earliest Jewish scriptures, there was no hell. The Hebrew word Sheol was used, and it meant a shadowy underworld, more like a resting place for all souls, good or bad. No fire, no torment, no Satan with a pitchfork. Just silence and sleep. Even in early Greek thought, ideas like Hades or Tartarus were symbolic. They were not meant as real places where people were physically tortured forever. They were moral stories. Metaphors for the consequences of one's actions, or the imbalance of justice in life. When Christianity emerged, it borrowed heavily from surrounding cultures. The early followers of Jesus were Jews living in a world filled with Greek and Roman myths about afterlife and punishment. Over time, those ideas blended together. Now comes the twist. Jesus himself spoke of Gehenna, not hell. Gehenna was a real valley outside Jerusalem. A place where garbage, animal carcasses, and sometimes even bodies of criminals were burned. It was a symbol of decay and moral corruption. It was never described as an eternal realm of fire for souls. But centuries later, the church needed more than symbolism. It needed authority. And nothing enforces obedience like the promise of heaven and the threat of hell. So, what did they do? They took the word Gehenna and slowly transformed it into something terrifying. An eternal furnace for all who disobeyed not just God, but the church itself. By the 4th century, as Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, theology was rewritten to serve power. Thinkers like Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas built elaborate justifications for eternal torment. They claimed hell was necessary to maintain divine justice, but in reality, it served a much more human purpose. It kept people in line. If you were told that questioning the church's authority might cost you eternal fire, you would keep your mouth shut. If you were told that paying indulgences could save your dead relatives from that same fire, you would hand over your coins. The business of fear was extremely profitable. The church turned hell into a product. Sin became the disease. The church became the doctor. And salvation became the prescription you had to buy. Dante's Inferno in the 14th century sealed the deal. The church found in his poetry the perfect imagery, circles of hell, demons, punishment for every sin imaginable. It gave shape to fear, and the people believed it. Paintings, sermons, theater plays, and religious art all spread this propaganda for centuries. But think about this. What kind of loving God needs eternal torture to make a point? If a human tortured someone forever for stealing, we would call it monstrous. But when God does it, we call it justice. That is the moral contradiction at the heart of religion's lie. If hell is real, then mercy is meaningless. If love is unconditional, then fear cannot be its tool. But the church knew that love alone cannot build an empire, fear can. Historically, hell has been used to justify everything from crusades to inquisitions. The church could threaten heretics, scientists, reformers, anyone who questioned dogma, with eternal damnation. Galileo was not just opposing the church's astronomy. He was accused of risking his soul. Women were burned as witches because hell was supposedly waiting for them. Scholars were silenced. Philosophers were branded heretics. Even the idea of thinking freely was associated with Satan. That is the level of psychological manipulation we are talking about. The image of hell turned people into obedient believers, not because they found truth, but because they feared punishment. A child is taught from the earliest age that disbelief could lead to endless fire. That fear burrows into the mind and shapes a lifetime of guilt. It is emotional blackmail disguised as faith. And yet, if we look deeper, we find that the concept of hell falls apart under logic. If God is all-knowing, he would know before creating someone that they would end up in hell, which means he created them for eternal suffering. That is not love, that is cruelty. If hell exists, it defeats the entire idea of forgiveness. Punishment without end means no chance for growth, no lesson, no mercy. Just vengeance. What kind of divine being builds a universe on eternal revenge? Now let's bring it closer to reality. Throughout history, every empire has needed a weapon of fear to maintain control. Kings used armies, tyrants used prisons. The church used hell. It made people police their own thoughts. You did not need a soldier to guard every citizen when every believer carried their own invisible prison inside their mind. The brilliance of the lie is that it is self-sustaining. Once people believe in hell, they teach it to their children. They spread it without needing evidence. They defend it even while it terrifies them. It is the perfect form of control, fear wrapped as morality. But the evidence for hell is non-existent. We have countless claims of near-death experiences, visions, and dreams, but no proof. And yet billions live their entire lives afraid of a place that has never been shown to exist. Let me ask something simple. If hell was truly real, would not a loving God warn us clearly and directly? Why would such an important truth depend on translation errors, church councils, and political decisions made centuries after Jesus died? The reason is simple. Because hell is not divine truth. It is human invention. And like every invention, it served a purpose. To control behavior. To build power. To collect wealth. To suppress free thought. The idea of hell has shaped cultures, governments, and laws. It has justified cruelty, censorship, and submission. But it has also created generations of guilt-ridden believers afraid to question anything. And here is the saddest part. Many good people live their entire lives trying to avoid hell. Not because they seek goodness, but because they fear punishment. That means their morality is not truly moral. It is obedience driven by terror. Imagine a world where people do good because it is good, not because they are afraid of fire. Imagine a child raised not with fear of damnation, but with understanding and empathy. That would be real progress. The church may have built empires on the back of hell, but the moment you stop believing, the chains fall off. Fear loses its power the instant you see it for what it is, a story told to keep you obedient. Hell was not sold to save you, it was sold to own you. Let's continue with how the church kept hell alive, century after century, even as human understanding evolved. In the early centuries of Christianity, beliefs were not unified. Different groups, called sects, had very different views about life after death. Some believed in eventual restoration, that all souls would return to God after purification. Others believed death was simply the end. But the version that served authority best was eternal punishment. The church chose fear over philosophy because fear works faster. The idea of hell grew stronger not from divine revelation, but from politics. The councils that defined church doctrine, like those in Nicaea and Constantinople, did not discover truth. They voted on it. Imagine that. Eternal torment decided by majority vote. And once decided, it became sacred law. Every century added a new layer of terror. The priests described flames, demons, and screams. Artists painted it on cathedral walls. The illiterate peasants who could not read Latin saw it in color and believed it. The more horrifying the image, the stronger the faith. Or rather, the fear. During the Middle Ages, hell became the church's insurance policy. If people questioned tithes, they were reminded that greed led to eternal fire. If people challenged priests, they were warned about heresy. Even kings bowed before bishops because hell hung over every throne. Then came the sale of indulgences, one of the darkest moments in church history. People were told they could buy their way out of punishment. Pay enough, and you could shorten your time in purgatory, or even free your loved ones from hell. Imagine the manipulation. First they invent a disease, sin. Then they invent the cure, indulgence. Then they charge for it. It was not religion anymore. It was business disguised as salvation. Martin Luther, during the Reformation, called this out as corruption. He nailed his 95 Theses in protest. But even he could not let go of the concept of hell completely. The fear was too deeply woven into theology. It had become the backbone of control. Remove it, and the structure of power collapses. Fast forward to today. You will find many modern Christians quietly ignoring hell. They talk about love, forgiveness, and inner peace, but rarely about fire and torment. That is not an accident. As education and logic spread, the image of hell became harder to defend. It looks too cruel, too human, too political. So now it survives mostly as a shadow, whispered in sermons but not questioned too loudly. Still, billions continue to fear it, not because they have proof, but because they were conditioned since childhood. When a child is told that disbelief leads to eternal pain, that child learns fear before reason. That fear becomes the foundation of faith, and that is why hell has lasted this long. If you think about it logically, eternal punishment makes no moral sense. Even in human justice, punishment ends when the crime is balanced or the lesson is learned. But in religion, hell has no end. It is infinite punishment for finite mistakes. No court on earth would call that justice. Only a system built on fear could. What kind of God needs eternal revenge to feel respected? A loving God could correct. A wise God could teach. But a vengeful God who burns his creation forever sounds more like a dictator than a deity. And yet, this image has worked for centuries. Because when people are afraid, they stop thinking. They cling to authority. They obey. That is how empires are built. Not on truth, but on terror. The psychological damage runs deep. People live in constant anxiety, afraid of their own thoughts. Natural human emotions like doubt, curiosity, or desire are labeled as sinful. Every time they make a mistake, they imagine flames waiting for them. This constant guilt becomes a prison of the mind. And when fear of punishment replaces moral understanding, humanity loses compassion. Hell was meant to make you obedient, but it also made you small. It made people believe they were worthless, deserving of pain. It taught them that their very existence was sinful, and in that guilt, they surrendered their freedom. Let us look at real life. How many parents have traumatized their children by telling them they will burn forever if they disobey? How many people have stayed in abusive religious communities because they were told leaving means damnation? How many young minds live in silent fear because they were taught their doubts are whispers of the devil? Hell is not just a theological lie. It is a psychological wound passed from one generation to another. Science has mapped galaxies, decoded DNA, split atoms, and extended life. Yet we still tremble at stories written 2,000 years ago about invisible fire. That shows how powerful fear can be when planted young. And what about morality? If people are good only to avoid hell, that is not goodness. That is self-preservation. True morality does not need a threat. It needs empathy, reason, and understanding. You help others because it makes the world better, not because you are afraid of flames. Religious defenders often say that without hell there would be chaos, that without fear people would sin freely. But look around. Crime, war, and corruption exist even among the most religious nations. Fear does not stop evil. It only hides it behind rituals. The irony is that the concept of hell has caused more suffering on earth than any imagined suffering in the afterlife. Wars, inquisitions, burnings, executions, all justified by the belief that saving souls from hell excused any cruelty. The church preached love while it built torture chambers in the name of God. If hell were real, it would be populated by those who used it to control others. The priests who scared children, the inquisitors who burned thinkers, the rulers who traded forgiveness for gold. Those are the architects of fear. But thankfully, hell is not real. It exists only in imagination, a relic of a fearful past. Once you understand that, the whole illusion collapses. Some will argue that removing hell removes morality. But morality existed long before religion. Early human societies learned cooperation because it ensured survival. Empathy evolved naturally. You do not need eternal punishment to tell you that killing is wrong or kindness is good. You need conscience, not commandments. When you remove hell from belief, you do not remove meaning. You remove manipulation. You make space for genuine goodness. Let us think about it another way. If a parent told their child, "Obey me or I will burn you alive," we would call that abuse. But when religion says the same thing, we call it faith. That contradiction alone should make any rational mind pause. Throughout history, those who questioned hell were branded heretics. Origen, who suggested universal salvation, was condemned. Giordano Bruno, who imagined infinite worlds, was burned alive. Every thinker who tried to free humanity from fear paid the price for truth. But they planted the seeds of reason that we now enjoy. Today, as more people turn toward science, philosophy, and humanism, the grip of hell is fading. The light of understanding does not destroy meaning. It replaces fear with awareness. The church can no longer sell hell the way it once did. The world has changed. Knowledge travels faster than sermons. A single question can break centuries of conditioning. Ask yourself, if hell were true, would it need to be sold through fear? Would it need paintings, threats, and centuries of propaganda? Truth stands on its own. Lies need constant defense, and hell has been defended for 2,000 years. What the church sold was not salvation. It was fear packaged as faith. It was obedience disguised as morality. And it worked, until people started to think. The greatest rebellion against this lie is not anger. It is awareness. When you stop fearing hell, you start living fully. You realize that goodness comes from within, not from divine threats. You see life as a brief, precious experience, not a test for eternity. Hell was invented to control the masses, but its power ends the moment you stop believing. That is the beauty of reason. It frees you without needing fire or reward. The church built its empire on guilt and fear. But fear is fragile. Once you question it, it vanishes. Once you see that no evidence supports it, you stop giving it power. So ask yourself, who benefits from hell? Not you, not humanity, only those who profit from your obedience. The truth is simple. Hell was never about your soul. It was about your submission. And once you understand that, you are free. No fire, no chains, no fear, just life, and the courage to live it honestly.